Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Landauer Talks webinar, How to Perform Small Field Dosimetry from People Who Do It for a Living. Presenting today are Matt Daniels, PhD, DABR, who's Director of the Landauer Medical Physics Commissioning Team, and Robert Statton, PhD, DABR, Senior Physicist on that team. I'm Linda Bosey of Landauer Marketing, and I'm happy to welcome you all here today. During this 1-hour session, we'll pause for questions at 4 points, so you can direct your question to that segment topic. And then you can place your questions in the questions area found on the right side of your screen. After Matt and Robert introduce themselves, we'll start with a poll question to get a sense of where you're joining us from. Then at the end of the webinar, you'll get a survey. Please take a few moments to fill that out, offer your ideas for future topics, and if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, indicate that in the survey. Also note that we are recording this webinar and we'll place it on the landauer.com Knowledge Center for later viewing and sharing. And now to Matt and Robert.
Thanks, Linda, for that great introduction. So first, we're going to go a little introduction about who we actually are. So we are part of Landauer Medical Physics, and we're a dedicated commissioning team. So we're a small team within Landauer, and our only job is to provide great commissioning services. With that, though, one of the benefits of being part of Landauer is we have a huge talent pool to pull from. So for instance, there's someone who has an older version of a treatment planning system or something like that, and we don't have experience with it. There's always someone within the company that we can rely on to help us out. And so the final thing we just want to ask, and we certainly, if you're interested, I've got that poll question at the end. What can we do to earn your business today? So the handsome guy on the left is Robert Statton, PhD, DABR. So I'll let him introduce himself very quickly.
Yeah, hi, my name is Robert. I'm one of the lead commissioning physicists here on the Landauer team. I have about 15 years of clinical medical physics experience, and I've been with Landauer for about 18 months now, and I've commissioned in the range of 40 to 50 machines at this point.
Thanks, Robert. And then this is Matt Daniels. I'm the guy on the right. I worked for Landauer actually for about 5 years as a clinical physicist, joined Sun Nuclear for several years, doing some product development, and then came back to Landauer about 2 years ago. I've commissioned probably around 100 machines at this point on a variety of platforms, Variant, Electa, you name it. So the first thing we want to talk about is why is measuring small fields scary? So one of the things we've noticed in medical physics is there's always, a lot of AAPMs, there's a lot of talks about small field dosimetry. And the reason it's scary is because if you do it wrong, it can have a huge effect. And the last thing any of us want to do is end up in the New York Times. So in this case, here's an article from 2010 where they actually measured output factors wrong for stereotactic radiation therapy. They didn't use the farmer chamber versus a correct chamber, and it caused a 50% overdose. And so obviously this is something you want to avoid, and this is something honestly we really push for, and something that we do in our commissionings is we always compare our data, whether it's an output factor or scans, against some known good data. And so we wish vendors would do a better job of actually providing this for all the different systems, all the different Srs Cones, small fields, etc. We feel that there's a gap in that sense in the market, and we hope they fill it. But one of the nice things about having a commissioning team is that we can we've got that background data to do those comparisons. And the same thing actually happened in France a couple years earlier. Unfortunately, because everything was in French, a lot of people didn't pay attention to it, and it kind of slipped through the cracks. And so one of the things though is, we kind of talk about these instances, we've got these, hey, this is really scary stuff, talks. But one of the things we don't do is we actually really don't give any data on what this actually looks like. How can you tell the difference? And so we decided to do that, and we're actually really surprised what we found. So here we have 3 different scans. The farthest one in the yellow-orange line is actually a 1-by-1 profile scan with a farmer chamber. The red line in the middle is a 1-by-1 profile scan with a 3D detector from PTW. And the blue line is a 1-by-1 scan with the PTW microsilicon. Now, obviously, you can tell the PTW microsilicon has a much better penumbra. It's a much better quality scan. But if you were just looking at these sort of a priori without having any knowledge of what it should look like, or even just kind of on its own, you really wouldn't know that a farmer chamber was actually that much worse than a 3D detector or that microsilicon detector. And so this just really goes to show is, one, you do need to, again, probably do some external validation, whether it's with an IROC Phantom or some of the other third-party Phantom before you start these programs. And also, have a set of comparison data that you can look at, because you might have just be able to take this scan with a farmer chamber. Okay, the profiles look a little wide, but they're probably fine. And then you go to the output factors, and there's a huge 50% difference. So the next thing I want to talk about is why the PTW beam scan is like a Ferrari. So one thing I want to mention is that, we aren't, paid by any vendor. There's no vendor sponsor of any of these talks. What we do as a commissioning group is we try a lot of equipment, and we use the stuff that we like the best and that works the best for us, right? We're a little bit specialized, and we're certainly, more than willing to talk about that. But we really like the PTW beam scan for a few reasons. One, it's a beautiful piece of equipment. We really like the design. It's very, very slick. It's very, very intuitive to use. The other part we really like is that for us, we do a lot of, with small fields, you might be doing 2PR measurements, draining and filling the water tank quite a bit. And the water reservoir is built into the PTW beam scan tank, which is really, really nice because it allows you to fill and then empty the tank very, very quickly without having to put an external pump in or anything like that. Also, just like the Sun Nuclear tank, it's actually going to be not going to be sitting on the turntable. The wheels are outside of that, so there's no weight on the turntable or any issues with that, which is great. So we got a couple quick videos. So one is just the tank moving up and down. The mechanical motion is really, really nice. And the reason we say that is because, when we first got it, we did a lot of centering every time we moved the tank up and down. However, what we found is that it actually changes, less than a tenth or 2/10 of a millimeter. And so we really don't need to do that centering unless we're going, probably for Srs Cones, we will go ahead and recenter it. But for standard scans, you can just move it up and down pretty much as you want and not have to worry about recentering the tank. The other nice thing we like about it is that filling and draining that I talked about. Now this video is a little bit accelerated. We didn't want to waste the webinar watching things fill and drain. But it does fill and drain very, very quickly. And it's very nice. And there's also a couple safety features in there where it'll actually fill really quickly for about 3/4 of the tank, and then it'll slow down for that last little bit until it hits a water sensor. So there's a water sensor in there to stop it, as well as you can fill the water sensor automatically. So it's got some good features with that as well. One of the other nice things, and really I gotta congratulate Sun Nuclear on this, is that they really kind of pushed water tanks forward a few years ago when they introduced the 3DS. One of the big innovations there was the auto setup features that the 3DS pushed, and now all the vendors had to catch up. And so that was a great thing that Sun Nuclear did. And PTW with the beam scan has kind of caught up in that sense. They're a little bit different in terms of how they do it, because Sun Nuclear actually uses the corrections, right? They'll actually rotate or tilt the tank itself to correct for it, whereas PTW does everything in software. But the end result is the same. Basically, all your scans are corrected for any leveling problems, any auto field alignment problems, which is really, really nice. And so you don't have to spend a lot of time. For us, the setup time using the beam scan has probably gone down probably about 40 minutes every time we set it up, just because of the auto setup versus having to do everything manually. One of the other nice things with the newest version of the software is that they have introduced even a finer correction with the beam inclination. And so this is really nice, especially for those, SRS cone profiles, where you can actually even adjust for the minute inclination in the Y and the X profiles. So it'll do 2 scans at 2 different depths. We like to use D max and then 300. And then you just set beam inclination, it'll autocorrect for those small adjustments as well. So how else is a PTW beam scan like a Ferrari? So we talked about how it's beautiful to look at, it's high performance, got some great features. But one of the other things is it does not work well with third-party parts. So here on the left-hand side, you have a nice PTW chamber holder with a PTW chamber. In this case, it's the 3D chamber. On the far right, again, you've got a PTW chamber holder with a microsilicon diode. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section. And in the middle, you have the most commonly used small field detector in the US, the Sun Nuclear Edge diode. And we had to 3D print a chamber holder for it. This is something that we both kind of wish that vendors did a much better job of. Is, if you're in a market, there's a very popular prevalent detector. Most centers aren't going to go out and buy a whole set of new detectors always when they're getting their water tank. Just create a chamber holder for those very popular detectors. The other thing that we do want to mention is also like the Ferrari, there's sometimes things need to be fixed. With the PTW beam scan, we are certainly not the most common users, right? We're not the people who are taking the tank out once a year to take some annual profiles. We're actually, shipping around the country every week and doing commissionings. And so with that, we've encountered a few little issues, for instance, with neutron dose affecting the electronics. We've had to swap them out. But I do want to say that PTW has been very responsive with that. It's one of the nice things about working with a smaller vendor is that they've been really responsive with us and working hard with us to ensure that the PTW, those issues are resolved. So we really appreciate that from PTW. All right, so now I think we've got our first poll question, and then Robert, if there's any questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them about the PTW beam scan or anything else. All right, great. Thanks for those poll results. I think, Robert, it looks like there's a couple questions popping in.
Right. So it looks like, what's your experience with other scanning systems?
Yeah, so we've used pretty much all the major scanning systems. The one we haven't used too much is a standard imaging one. It's not quite as prevalent out there, but we have used the Sunny scanning system as well as the IBA system. For us, we've got some requirements about something that holds up really well when it's shipped all over the country. And that's something we found PTW has been really, really robust, and other systems not quite as much. If you have a system and you like it, I'm sure it's going to work great for you. They're all can take scans. They all can take high quality scans. One other thing I did want to mention about the PTW scan system is a little bit different though, is that it allows you to apply different voltage. So we can use a larger reference chamber and then still use a diode for our main detector, which is really nice because that's what we normally do, so that we can get a bigger signal on the reference and then get the, have the zero voltage applied to the diode like a microsilicon or an edge detector. So that's one other feature we do like about it.
Okay, there's another question about continuous scanning versus point-to-point scanning with the beam scan. I think we're gonna
address that. Yeah,
we're gonna cover that in the next section. And then also, what is your best detector duo for small fields that creates comparable results?
Yeah, I mean, so normally, and we'll get to this in the next section as well. So maybe I'll just go ahead and jump into that and I'll start answering those questions.
Okay.
Yep. All right, so now, yeah, we're gonna have the tale of two detectors here. So we've kind of got one that's kind of the old standby, which I kind of believe is sort of like the BlackBerry. It's the one that's been around for a while, but it's hasn't really advanced very much in the last, let's say, 10 years. And on the right, we have a new contender for the throne. Something that's got a very much slicker, much better interface, much faster. And we'll kind of talk about that now, which one's which. You can kind of figure out on your own, hopefully. So the one we have, and so the two we're going to talk about today, and we'll kind of touch base on other detectors later, is the Edge Detector, which again is a very common detector, especially in the US. And then the microsilicon diode, which is a new small field detector out from PTW. We have started transitioning to the microsilicon, and the reason is several-fold. So a big one is actually correction factors. And so this is just a graph of the correction factors for the microsilicon diode in black and the Edge detector in orange. And as you can see, the Edge detector has about a 5% correction at 0.8, and then the graph stops. And it doesn't go down to those any smaller field sizes. And the reason is, this is actually from TRS 483, which is sort of one of the documents kind of like the Bible on correction factors. It's got correction factors from many detectors and many different field sizes. They actually recommended the correction factors over 5% don't use the detector. And so that's why they stopped at 0.8, because now the correction factor is over that, and they said that you should find a different detector to use. Versus if you look at the microsilicon, you can see the correction factors, even at 0.6, are only down to 0.983. And so instead of a 5 or 6% correction, you're now only dealing with a 1.7% correction. Now, one argument is that, well, you've got the correction factors, so you should just be able to correct for it and you're fine. One of the challenges with this is that for small fields, right, it's not just correction factors for cones. A lot of times you want to build a small field output factor table. And although you might have a 1x1 correction factor, one of the things that none of these documents has is a correction factor for a 1x15 or a 2x12. And so you have a built-in error in your output factor tables because you don't know what that correction should be. And so you would rather use a chamber that has as small of a correction as you can to minimize or reduce that error. Now, with that being said, one of the things we really wish PTW will do is, the Edge has been around a long time, and so it has a full set of correction factors for different energies, cones, CyberKnife, you name it, versus the microsilicon is newer, and so we only right now use it for 6X because that's the only published correction factors that are available. But as soon as they're available for other energies, then we will certainly start using it. One of the questions that we're always going to get is, okay, so we've got that, output factors look good, correction factors look good, how do the profiles compare? The Edge does have a little bit smaller volume, so how does that affect the profiles? Well, as we can kind of see based on our last discussion versus a farmer versus a much smaller 3D detector, there is really no difference in the profiles for an Edge detector versus a PTW microsilicon. The other things about it is it's a much less noisy detector, and so we're actually able to increase the scan speed while maintaining the same amount of quality. And when you're doing output factors with the microsilicon detector, you can actually run it in rate mode because the rate stabilizes, so it speeds up that. Versus the Edge detector, you cannot do that. If you take 3 different edge measurements with an Edge detector, you're going to get 3 slightly different results, and you're going to have to average them. So this beautiful photo is by our staff photographer, Robert Statton. So if anyone's looking for some wedding photos or high school graduation photos for their kids, go ahead and contact Robert. He's happy to do that. So this is one of the reasons we like the PTW beam scan system is that we've got this nice large volume 0.3 PTW detector in a 1x1 field. And as you can see, it's not crossing any of the axes. So we get nice clean scans on the X and the Y axis. And the PTW beam scan system lets us use this and then also use that microsilicon diode for the PDD and profile measurements. So one of the other things we'd never really seen before is, what happens if you actually have a detector cross, one of the X or Y axes. And so as you can see, if you're at Dmax, it's pretty obvious, right? You see a big dip in there, you can really tell that, hey, it's time to go in and move that reference detector out of the field and then just, repeat the scan. However, if you're at, depth, you've got a lot of, the scatter conditions are very different. They kind of fill in that gap and you can't really tell, is that just maybe a little bit of symmetry error or something else going on? Or is that actually, a bad detector placement? So when you're running this type of scans, we always recommend that you always check Dmax so you can actually make sure that your detector isn't crossing over any of the axes. One of the other points we want to talk about is scan modes. I think some of the other questions in there was, do you use continuous? Do you use, step by step? So our thought on this is that we used the best scan mode for that type of scan. For large fields, we love continuous. It's very, very quick. You have the data is the same quality, and so you get the same results, whether you're doing step by step or if you're doing continuous. However, for small fields, there is a difference. And the reason is, if you have a small field step-by-step scan, what you can do is you can say in the penumbra, I'm going to scan, more sparsely, or sorry, not in the penumbra, in the outside the field edge, you can scan more sparsely. And in the penumbra, and especially, around the central axis, you can really tighten up those points and really slow down that scan and get a really nice scan. Versus if you, even with really slow modes, with continuous, the scan will look jaggy. So here you can see the nice smooth scan is step by step in this image, and the one that kind of jumps around from point to point is continuous. And so we really like to use the best mode for the best type of scan, but for small fields, we stick by step by step. All right, so with that, I think we're ready for the second poll question, and also any other questions. It looks like there's quite a few coming in.
Yeah, Matt. So there's several questions about different kinds of detectors for small fields. So in particular, what is your experience with using diamond detectors or the W2 scintillator detector from Standard Imaging?
Yeah, so we have used the diamond detector. Honestly, again, I mean, if you are very comfortable with the detector, you use it a lot, it's probably great. But we have a little bit different requirements than most people. So one is for the PTW detector, there's a couple, or the diamond detector, there's a couple things that we find a little bit challenging. One is you have to pre-irradiate it. And so if you don't do that, you get, your scans are pretty noisy. And also, again, for those output factors, those are much noisier than with the microsilicon diode. And again, we don't see any difference in the penumbras for the small field scans. So there's really no reason to use the micro diamond versus the, the microsilicon. However, if you've got a micro diamond and you're happy with it, then that's fine. In terms of the W2, we have used scintillator detectors. I mean, one of the great things about scintillator detectors is that there is no correction factor, right? It's always 1 across the board, which is awesome. However, one of the things we want to be able to do on a commissioning team is use tools that are really robust and really reliable. And anytime you introduce things like in the scintillator detector, you've got to have an extra electrometer in the room that converts the light to an electrical signal. You've got to do a calibration process with it. We just don't find that all those extra steps and all that extra work is, worth it for what we're doing. You don't really get that much more out of it. Again, though, if you've got it and you're happy with it, I'm sure it's a great detector.
There's also a couple of questions about other reference detectors, like larger reference detectors you may, attach to the gantry or transmission. Can you comment on the use of those and our need for them?
Yeah, sure. So honestly, we find, and Robert will, it's kind of teasing Robert's giveaway in the next section, but we have found really no need for those larger field reference detectors. I mean, in my mind, it's sort of I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of emails from PTW and Sun Nuclear about this, but it's sort of a solution looking for a problem to put it, because honestly, and Robert will kind of show how we do it for Srs Cones, but we don't really need it for small fields, and we don't really need it for Srs Cones. So to us, there's really not a need for those larger reference detectors.
All right.
All right. Well, with that, I'll hand it over to Robert for the second half.
All right. Let's move on to Srs Cones. Today we just want to show or give you guys just some tips and tricks on things that we do for Srs Cones, and then we'll also cover some validation for small fields, as well as multi-met Winston-Letts application and some verification for HyperArc. So starting with Srs Cones, since we have seen some questions too about the placement of the reference detector. So in particular for Srs Cones, we know that can be challenging, and we found a great way to get around that is that you can actually for the variant ICVI cones, which are shown on the left hand side, and then this is a Actina set of cones that can be used on the Electa. We've commissioned both. You can actually fit a detector above the cone mount into the open field without obstructing, the actual open cone or shadowing the cone profile itself. So that's more easily seen over here on the right-hand side. You can see this is the largest cone on the Actina set, which is a 15 millimeter. And so if you have an open 5x5 field, above that, you can see that's not shadowing at all, and you're getting some really good reference signal there for your scanning. And like Matt mentioned, the nice thing, about the PTW beam scan system is that you can actually use 2 different chambers with different biases while you're scanning. So you can have, an edge detector or a silicone microsilicone diode that has no bias, but you can have a reference chamber up in the head that does, an ion chamber that does require bias. So that's another nice thing about the beam scan system and its use for cone scanning. So another thing I think Matt touched on too is that to make sure that you rerun centering with your Srs Cones. So we found that there can be some slight shifts, of course, with the cones compared to the open field that when you get down to those really small 4 millimeter cones. There, you can see some, differences in the profiles. So if you do really good, centering for that and good setup, you can get some really good results. So this is showing the 4mm cone PDD scan compared to reference data. So you can see here, this is a gamma comparison of half a millimeter. You can see that, virtually 100% points are passing, and just a slight difference at the surface, which you can get when you're comparing scans from the different detectors. So one of the nice things about our group and our experience is that we do have a lot of data collection from multiple machines that we can compare to. So we actually have a reference data set with different detectors that we can compare to when we're scanning a new machine, just to make sure that everything's looking really good. Here is shown a cross plane at 5 cm, again for a 4mm cone. So again, you can see really good comparison. If you do take your time, do good a good set of scans with using step-by-step scanning and centering, you can get a really good set of data. Matt touched on the ability of the beam scan system to do TPR measurements. So this is really nice because there's no additional attachments that are needed for the system. The water goes in and out of the reservoir, pretty much seamlessly. So I'm just going to show you an example here, a video of the tank. This is sped up, of course, of it draining during a TPR measurement. So you can see that the chamber moves down, and the TPR measurement starts right there pretty quickly afterwards. And right before the measurement, when you do the TPR setup, the system does a calibration of the drain rate. And so this is great for systems that do require TPR measurements, say for SRS cones, cone scans, where you can get some easily acquire the same data with a very easy setup, and you can easily switch back and forth between open scanning and then into cone scanning with pretty much a lot of ease. So we have time for a few questions on anything that we've covered so far. Got anything, Matt?
Yes, Robert, I think I've got a few questions for you. So one question is, how does the surface dose change with the detector?
Yeah, so we see, like I mentioned, we do when we're comparing different scans from different detectors, say, if we have reference data from an Edge detector and we compare that to a microsilicone, we will see can see some large differences, right at the surface, just because of the inherent differences in the detectors. But once you get, to Dmax and beyond, there's really, the detectors perform very similarly, especially for, SRS cone scanning.
So one question is, it's kind of a couple questions. So what is our kind of experience, not necessarily with cones, but with small fields in general for like a halcyon? How do we approach that?
Right. Yeah. So I'll touch on that a little bit later, but we do validation for small field scans for MLC based SBRT type commissionings or halcyon. And again, we have reference data that we've taken on multiple machines that we can compare to, but we usually see really good agreement, say even with the TPS, and I'll actually show a comparison of that. That actually came from a halcyon in the next section.
All right, cool. And then do you have any advice on reference detectors for small MLC shaped fields?
I mean, we generally use, just a small ion chamber for those. And so you can generally get those in the corner of the field, and you're able to get enough, reference detector signal for those.
All right, great. Thanks, Robert.
Okay. All right, so in the next section, we're going to talk about, mostly about validation. So, there were some questions about MLC commissioning. And so, as you may know, for example, for Eclipse, which we do a lot of Eclipse commissionings, there's really not much that goes into the treatment planning system as far as output factors, for small MLC fields. It's all based off of the DLG and transmission. And so we like to do, validation of our small fields for that. And so, what we like to do is we collect output factors at a different depth than the ones that are put into the treatment planning system, and compare output factors to those. So you can see here, for example, this was from a commissioning that we did actually on a Halcyon system with comparison of down to a 1x1 MLC field. And this is based off of MPPG 5A, 7.1 and 7.2. And you can see that we, for a 1x1 field for MLC, we can get agreement depending on the algorithm of down, for example, in this case, down to 2 to 3%. Now, often we do see, for small, jaw-defined fields or MLC fields, down to 1x1, typically we can see large differences of maybe up to 5 to 7%, in some cases. So that is something that is not unusual, especially, in systems like, Eclipse, where it's not actually modeling the leaf ends very well. So it's not atypical. Here you can see we did a PDD comparison. Actually, this is showing 2%, 2 millimeters here for 6 FFF beam. You can see we get pass rates compared to the treatment planning system of, above 99%. So that's actually what this comparison is. And so, we really recommend, that you have a way that you can compare scans to the treatment planning system. And one easy way to do that is using the MPPG 5A tool that's readily available, which is, a really nice thing that group did for the community. So, it's open source. It has really good instructions you can find, on the website. And you can basically set up a water phantom in your treatment planning system and compare your scans directly to the, the treatment planning system profiles. So this was actually on a Halcyon. It's a comparison of a 1x1 PDD, the results that I showed you before for AAA. You can see that the pass rate is 99.9% in this case. So again, we can get, really good agreement if you spend time setting up the tank well and have, good tools at your disposal. For our SRS Cones TPS validation, what we do is, again, we like to measure them, at a different depth than the output factors that we put into the system. And those correction factors, you want to make sure you apply those as well, and that, Matt mentioned earlier, for whatever detector you are using. So you can see that, we do apply, a correction factor for depending on the chamber. Now these were taken with an edge detector, so you can see there's some pretty large correction factors down to the 5 millimeter and 4 millimeter cone. So you want to make sure that you do apply those. But you see here that, for the CDC model and Eclipse, that you can get, differences down to, less than 2% for, comparison to your measured versus the treatment planning system. So you can get, pretty good agreement there. So next I want to talk about single isocenter multi-met applications and in what kind of QA and validation, that you can do for that. So this is obviously, increasing in its use, and it has some really great, features for, of course, the patients, because the treatments go faster than, moving the isocenter around to the different lesions. But obviously it creates some concerns as well as how do you QA this. And I want to cover a little bit of, what we've done. Obviously, HyperArc is becoming, more readily available as people upgrade Eclipse. So it's becoming, more widespread in use. So, the main concern is that if you look at the error propagation as you move off axis from the isocenter, that becomes much of a bigger concern in these applications. So I'm going to give full credit to Brett Miller here from the University of Tennessee Medical Center. I stole this directly from him. I thought this was a great little graphic here that shows if your tolerance is 1% for gantry and collimator and half a degree, sorry, 1 degree for gantry and collimator and half a degree for a table, and if you're near those maximums as you move off axis for a single center ISO or single isocenter application, that doesn't really affect you so much. But as you move off axis and these multi-met applications, now you're going to start missing your target. So as you can see, as you move off axis, up to 5 centimeters from the isocenter, you're off more than a millimeter, which by most standards is what we look for for stereotactic applications, is we want everything to be within a millimeter. And so that there's been several studies that have shown that can reduce your PTV coverage quite a bit, say up to 30 to 50%, depending on how far off your gantry, collimator, or table rotation might be. So how can you assess that targeting accuracy? Looking at the tools available, we decided to try out the Sun Nuclear Multi-Met Winston Lutz cube for our hyperarc commissionings, and we found it to be a really great tool for this application and really easy to use. So the Multi-Met Winston Lutz cube has multiple targets off axis up to 7 centimeters and allows for easy evaluation of your targeting accuracy outside of the isocenter. And so for our hyperarc commissionings, we're using this. The software from the Sun Nuclear is really easy to use. What it does is it provides an RT plan file that's easily exported and imported into your system for your machine. And it delivers up to 19 different images at a variety of gantry, couch, and collimator rotations for you to be able to assess how those inaccuracies or slight changes in rotation may change the positioning of your isocenter or targeting of lesions off axis. And it includes an automated image analysis tool. So essentially, you collect those images on the portal imager. And then you can download those images and use the tool, and then it will analyze it for you. So here's just some examples of what that looks like. So if you set your criteria for fail at 1 millimeter, maybe you're warned at 0.75, those are the defaults. Then it highlights here where you may have some issues on your machine. So this was for a new Edge system that we commissioned, where you can see that on the isocenter, so it gives you not only the isocenter values, but also gives you the off-axis targets. So you could actually even use this tool just by itself if you wanted just to assess single isocenter type applications. But for off-axis, you can see here that we're still within a millimeter. And maybe it's highlighting here that, for example, that there's something going on. We're a little bit more wobble, around 180 degrees on the gantry. It also breaks out results specifically for the couch and the collimator for the expected versus measured angles. And so you can see here in this case that they were all within 0.2 degrees. So again, really easy system to use, to set up, and pretty much worked flawlessly for us, straight out of the box. Within a few hours, we had this up and running, and worked really well. Okay, so for hyperarc validation, we found that the SRS map check is a really great tool for that. in combination with the stereo fan. So this is just showing the SRS map check and its calibration fixture on the table. So very straightforward calibration process to go through in the software. Again, like, very similar to the standard map check or arc check. There's prompts to, detect or to direct you, through the calibration process. Again, very direct, easy to use. Once you have the calibration, set up, then you can place the map check inside the stereo fan. And the nice thing about that is, they have corrections built in for, various angles of incidence. So you can actually use this, with all rotations included, including the couch for your plan. So you can do full end-to-end testing, even including vertex fields. So it's a really nice way to be able to deliver these plans and have confidence that you're targeting, what you think you are. So, obviously, those METs can be, widely distributed and can be hard to line up, in a single plane. One of the nice things about the tool in SNC Patient that they have is this QA setup tool, which allows you to shift the stereo fan and the map check image and be able to tell where the stereo fan and the map check are intersecting the plan. And so you can try to capture as many of those lesions as you can in one plane. Now, obviously, if you want to capture every single lesion, you may have to capture multiple planes. So that's, really up to the user, and, it's specific to the plan as well. And not only can you shift it, but you can also rotate the plane. So you can see here, there's a small rotation that we've included of the detector and the transverse plane, which allows you, again, to capture, more of the lesions on the map check up to, about 7 centimeters off axis. So once you've determined that, optimal position of the map check, you can then apply those shifts in the room. So the software tells you where to shift the stereo fan. And then you can also, it also gives you instructions on how to shift that in the treatment planning system so that you can recalculate the dose at that position and be able to compare it in the SNC Patient software. So here you can see some of the results for a test hyperarc plan that we did at One Commissioning, where you can see that we got really good agreement this was using a gamma of 2% 1 millimeter. We got a pass rate of, above 99%. So again, this just shows you, this was actually an example from our very first, one of our very first hyperarc commissionings. So you can see, we had really good success with, very little effort for, these types of applications. It can just really give you, ease of mind that you're, delivering, quality treatment to your patients. So that is the end of the presentation, but see lots of questions in the chat. Matt, is there any questions that we should go ahead and address now?
So I think the biggest one, and this is, I've been kind of trying to keep up on this, is really, the biggest question is probably, has verification failed with the multi-met Winston Blitz analysis, and kind of what would your recommendation be if it did fail?
Right. Yeah. So again, I give credit back to Brett Miller because I've seen some examples of older machines where they did use the multi-met Winston Let's Cube on machines that obviously have been running a while, and there may be some change compared in the isocenter for gantry collimator and table rotation. And that, really you'd have to address that, with your service engineer to be able to, hone that isocenter in and get better results. Another thing too is that, if you didn't have the ability to do that, let's say that if it was worse farther off axis, you could limit, how far off axis you're treating. So you could say, you know, if my results aren't good at 7 centimeters, but they're good at 5 centimeters, and you can say, okay, well, you know, we're only going to treat, you know, lesions that are up to 5 centimeters, you know, off axis.
All right. So another question would be, in your mind, sort of how often, you know, with this multi-met with sluts, do you think clinically be run? Obviously, you know, it's something we just run as part of the commissioning process once, but you know, kind of clinically, what would you kind of think of the recommendation?
Yeah, I think it's so, you know, it's very easy to run. I mean, I would, if you've got an active, you know, multi-met program, then I would probably run it monthly. I mean, it's really easy to run, so I don't see any downsides with that.
Cool. So yeah, do we actually have any more? Let's see, I guess there's a bunch more. Yeah, wow, okay. Sorry, give me 1 second. SRS map check over portal dosimetry. What do you think? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, portal dosimetry, you know, I mean, it does, I mean, I guess there's probably some limitations there. I mean, you're still, I don't know. I mean, I haven't done a lot with, you know, hyperarc and portal dosimetry, but I mean, you still have those concerns about, you know, the actual targeting accuracy. I mean, you're really comparing kind of just dose plane to dose plane in portal dosimetry, and you're not necessarily assessing the spatial accuracy of where that delivery is. So I think that's, you know, what, you know, the benefit of the, you know, the SRS map check and the stereo fan has. I mean, and that can be something, you know, maybe, you know, you do, you know, testing with the, you know, the SRS map check, maybe less frequency, you know, less frequently, if you have confidence, you know, in that, like, since obviously something like portal dosimetry, you know, or using like fraction 0 and sun check is definitely easier to deliver. Then, you know, maybe you can use a combination of the two.
Cool. Let's see. Wow. Would you use SRS map check for routine patient QA?
I mean, yeah, you could. I mean, it's just that you have the limited field size of, you know, about 7 cm by 7 cm, I think, on the detector plane itself.
All right.
And I think you can shift it around in the software to get a larger field size, so you can stitch them together as well if you had a little bit larger field that you wanted to measure.
All right, sorry, I'm trying to. All right, so, oh yeah, so there's a bunch of other questions. I mean, I'll just take this one, so probably a little bit of a break. So about, you know, the IBRS solid state detector array versus the PTW. Honestly, we haven't used those, right? So that's why we haven't commented on them. We are probably going to potentially use the PTW, get a loaner and kind of play with it. With that, but right now our experience is mostly with the Sun nuclear one, which is why we're talking about it. So yeah, so we don't really have any comments on, you know, equipment we haven't used yet. So, but when we use it, maybe what we're gonna have, our goal is to actually have a webinar probably every quarter. We've got some more poll questions. Actually, do you mind putting up the poll question about the next two? We've got 2 more, I believe. And I'll kind of answer some questions as we do that. So this one's just, yeah, where do you live? And well, I'll keep answering questions while we're kind of going through this. And then let's see, a bunch. Oh, have you had any challenges, concerns about the SRS map check internal correction factors? So far, no. I mean, we've gotten very, very good agreement with the plans. You know, I actually used to work at Sun. They do a very good job of characterizing those diodes, and especially because and you know, Sun can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that they're actually the 2nd generation diodes in the SRS map check, and so they've got less inherent correction needed. So yeah, I really don't have any concerns about that. Do you use different commissionings for small versus large field? Yes, we kind of touched on that. The main difference is really what jump in, feel free to jump anytime. It would be Thanks, Ray. Can we also jump to the third one while we're going? The main difference would be, for large fields, we'd use a different chamber. The PDW beam scan comes with a 3D detector, so it's the same in both the X and the Y axis. And so we really like that, right? So you don't have any difference of number if you're doing an in-plane scan versus a cross-plane. And again, we use the continuous mode for the scanning versus for the small fields, we use, a very different detector, in this case, mostly the microsilicon diode. And then we use, the stepwise mode versus continuous mode for scanning. One other question is, how much variation of measured data among true beams? So this is a good question. It really depends. So one of the things, normally for photons, for like PDDs, profiles, we don't see too much difference. The one thing we do see a lot of times though, and this is just a heads up, is that when you're getting a true beam installation, MPPG 5A and our commissioning process, HyperArc now. Okay, cool. Well, thanks guys. We'll start working on that. So for PDDs and profiles, we don't see much. But with profiles, the difference we usually see is that, now, especially the last few jobs, what Varian does with the installation is they actually use the IC profiler. And with the last few jobs, we have really seen a big difference between the IC profiler, installer sets it up, results are, less than 0.5% in terms of symmetry, everything looks good. We go to scan it, it's off by like 1.5% or more. And so we've got to call Varian in and have them actually do some beam steering for us. And so we're seeing that a bit, so that's kind of a little bit concerning to us, because it seems like, that's the whole thing with the IC profiler, right, is it should be water equivalent. This should be pretty much matching closely to what you see with, if you're using a detector in water. However, I don't know, part of it might be the depth they're using. That could be potentially part of it. I don't know, Robert, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, other than, I think we've seen some differences in, electron energy, but, other than that, the true beams are pretty solid compared to each other. But yeah, we've seen some, I think there's, especially with rapid installs too, we've seen, they can be, maybe things are kind of sped along too fast. And that is definitely something that I would recommend, checking is, checking your symmetry with something other than, the vendor equipment, before they leave, if possible, because that's something that we run into after the fact. I saw a question about, treating, trigems with, MLC based. I don't think that's generally accepted. In most cases, since you're delivering such a high dose for those, most of the time, people use cones for that. I think that's, the safest thing to do in that case. What else? There was a question also about using small volume ion chambers for scanning. I think that, for point dose measurements, that would certainly be fine. For scanning, those can be a bit more noisy. So that's why we prefer, something like the Edge Detector or the, microsilicone for scanning. What else?
Oh, I think, well, there's a question about, with gold beam data becoming readily available, the house and true beam defined validation. So projects increasing your practice. So really, we could still consider that a commissioning. So what we do is we just take we call it a representative data comparison. So we build the model, let's say, and this is usually for true beam and eclipse. Electa also has something similar with Electa and Monaco, where they have sort of standard beam models. And honestly, a few other vendors are looking at moving in this direction. But usually what we do is we take a subset of data, we compare that back to the representative data, and we actually build the model off the representative data. So it's effectively a full commission in my mind. It's really just you're doing a more limited subset of the scans and then comparing it against that representative data. Mm-hmm. But other than that, the process is effectively the same, and we still do, output factor comparisons. We do scan comparisons. For electrons, we take all of the output factors from that. We take all of the profile measurements needed for PDIs for electrons. As Robert said, one of the things we do find is that electrons, especially for true beams, are off a little bit more than the photons. And so sometimes we'll either, if they're off far enough, we'll, one of the things that we always do is we kind of talk to the site as we're going through the commissioning process. We say, okay, this is what we're finding. What do you want us to do about it? For instance, your symmetry. Do you want us to adjust it now before we do the scans, or do you want to do that after the fact because you can just do it with your IC profile, your water tank? Or, for an electron, if it's far enough, would you rather us build a custom model, or would you rather have Varian come in and adjust the energy? So we kind of work with the site and let them kind of determine what path they want forward.
There's several questions about specifically for an eclipse. Would you recommend maybe a different DLG or separate beam models for small field, plans? And that's, of course, DLG is kind of, one of the thorns in our sides because it's, different, essentially for, every machine. And so, in some cases, we've seen where, there is a need to do, DLG tuning specifically for small fields. And that, I think it really just depends on, the application for the individual clinic. But that's something definitely that can be done. One of the nice things about the newer version, newer versions of Eclipse is that you can, create different or use different DLGs for different algorithms as well, so that you can kind of fine tune that in. But it, there definitely you can see a need for that, potentially depending on your machine. And if you were, we found, for example, that if you want to match two machines, the best way to do that, again, is to match the physical gap on the machine. So, in service mode, there's a way to set the physical gap that's set up during the installation. And that doesn't necessarily give you the best results, in your comparisons with the treatment planning system. And so, the best way to do that is to match, if you're matching two machines, is to match the physical gap on the two of those. What other questions? We've got, what, maybe like a couple more minutes, Matt, before we need to wrap up. But let's see.
So one was define physical gap. So this, I'll just kind of jump off what Robert was saying. So what we're talking about here is, so like you guys, a lot of people don't realize this, but so if you're in like a Tribune service mode, if you go to MLC, there's a couple settings that they can change. And so there's actually basically there is a QA test the installers run that we're finding to set this basically a physical gap between the banks and a gap, an offset for both banks. And what Robert is saying is that whatever your setting is on one machine, if you've got a DLG and you're happy with it, in order to match that machine, those settings in service mode have to be exactly the same from one machine to the next. Otherwise, you can't, add them to kind of sort of a group, a dosimetrically equivalent group in Eclipse, and you'll have some problems. Your QA results won't be the same from one machine to the next. So we saw a lot of things with separate DLG for BMAP versus 3D. We really haven't seen a need for that. We know that some people do a separate DLG for VMAP versus IMRT. It's not something we've had to deal with or seen. Basically, our criteria is, the same as the TD task group. We always do 3%, 2 millimeters above 95%. We use a very rigorous head and neck plan where if that passes, pretty much we haven't had any complaints from customers saying, hey, I've had to go back and adjust my DLG. With that being said, though, and even though we say 95%, we always try to shoot for 97, 98. We can usually achieve that. One of the caveats with that is, if you've got Acros and AAA, you've got two different algorithms. You have one DLG, and they will give different results. And so we always ask customers, and it also depends on your QA method, right? Are you have an arc check? Do you have a map check too? Are you using portal dosimetry? Every QA method will have a little bit different results for your DLG. And so we always ask the customer, how do you want us to fine tune that DLG? What are you going to use for QA? What should we focus on making sure it passes at the highest rate possible? So we always kind of work with the customers to define
One other good question on here is, how long does it take us to commission a new true beam with 5 electron and 5 photon energies? Typically that takes us, we can usually get it done within a week. So, we have a dedicated team that comes in. We have usually 2 physicists on site. We have an engineer, and usually we have a resident as well, because we have a residency program within Landauer. And so we usually have a team of 3 to 4 people that come in. We work, kind of like 12 to 14 hours a day running the machine. And so in general, we can get it done typically within, maybe even 4 or 5 days, depending also, if you're using representative data or if you're using, if you want custom models. So, the advantage of, using a commissioning team is just that, we've got all of our, processes, down very efficiently, and we've just got, a lot of experience with it, so we can troubleshoot faster. We've got all of our scan queues already set up, and we can hit the ground running, and with the beam scan, once we get it, uncrated, we can get up and running, typically in, 20 to 30 minutes. So, really pretty quick there. So, I think it's probably about time to wrap up. We're just past the hour. So thank you all for your attention, and thank you all for the great questions. We do ask that you stick around at the end. There's a survey that's going to come up at the end of the webinar. And if you'd like additional information, on our commissioning services, please indicate that. And we can have, someone from our team contact you directly. And feel free to reach out to us. We have a website on the Landauer Commissioning page too that you can access to learn more information about our team.
Yep, thanks, Robert. Yep, I think we're going to wrap up now. So appreciate everyone's comments. A lot of great questions. Hopefully we got to as many as we could.